Ramsar Records' David Childers reteams with producer Don Dixon for Run, Skeleton, Run. The lauded North Carolina singer-songwriter's latest effort features vocals and banjo contributions by Scott Avett of the Avett Brothers. Road to Now listeners can even get a 20% off discount on David Childers' new album by using the promo code HISTORY at ramsarrecords.com.
I'm Bob Crawford.
And I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now.
We had a wonderful opportunity to interview someone. This opportunity came through our good friend Chris Freitz, and we spoke with Mitch Yockelson.
He is currently working on a project to get a memorial to the World War I soldiers on the National Mall. And this is something that's pretty amazing to me as a historian, you know, that we have a lot of memorials, but we have done very little when it comes to World War I. So we have all these American troops ended up going all over the world. And this is a period where a lot of people see a lot of things. Black soldiers, as we talked about in this interview, black soldiers get to see what it's like to live somewhere that doesn't look down on them because of the color of their skin. And so it's this crazy period, but also it shapes American history afterwards. And this is something we didn't cover in the interview, because when World War II starts to break out, you know, in the 30s, when you see the fascist governments rising, what you see is that there's clear signs we need to get involved. The slaughter at Nanjing, the massacre there, the Spanish Civil War and the coup by the fascists, Hitler invading and taking over territories. We turned a bit of a blind eye because a lot of Americans felt like what got us involved in World War I was being too heavily involved in European affairs.
A lot of historians these days are looking at that period between World War I and World War II as the interwar period. Just a brief break in the action, but we're going to hear more about that coming up. Mitch Yockelson, welcome to The Road to Now.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Mitch, this is the Centennial anniversary of the United States entrance into World War I. Is that correct?
It is. On April 6th of 2017, 100 years ago, the United States entered the war against Germany, and it was somewhat of a surprise considering that President Woodrow Wilson had just won re-election based on a platform of keeping America out of the war. But there were a few things that turned him and twisted his ideas, which he laid out brilliantly before both houses of Congress on a rainy Monday evening on April 2nd of 1917, where he sold the idea that the U.S. should be in the war.
And how did he do that? How did he make that case to the people? Because once again, I always joke in my classes, he ran on the slogan, he kept us out of war, not he'll keep us out of war. But how did he make this argument and turn what was a pretty divided population on the side of going into the war?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. The U.S. certainly was divided. When you think about what our population was like and all of the immigrants we had, well, we had a number of German immigrants, you know, Chicago and Milwaukee, just come to think of it, even not far from where I live in Baltimore, there were huge German population. And so those folks were thinking if the U.S. does get into the war, maybe they should get on the side of the Central Powers and support Germany.
Right.
And then there were the other factions. You know, we had a lot of course, Irish Americans in this country, and they couldn't stand the British. So they were thinking along the same lines, too. If the U.S. does enter this war, we don't want them supporting Great Britain. But the Wilson administration and most of the country recognized that had the U.S. got into the war at some point, it would be on the side of the Allies. And really what made President Wilson change his mind are a couple of things. February of 1917, the Germans were very aggravated that the U.S. was sending a lot of merchant ships over to Europe, bringing supplies and munitions. And so in their mind, the U.S. actually was already in the war against them. They were already a belligerent, maybe not in uniform and not through declaration, but the sheer fact that the U.S. was supporting the war for financial gain. So merchant ships were getting sunk at a regular rate. And then what really tipped the balance is the so-called Zimmerman telegram, which was sent from a German envoy to the Mexican government and basically tried to coerce Mexico into going to war with the United States, which would have been the second time since we were at war with them in 1846-48. Well, at that time, when the U.S. won, we had the territories of New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. So the Germans were trying to broker a deal with the Mexicans that, hey, look, if you go to war, we'll support you, and if we win this thing, you'll get those three now states back. And Mexico wisely decided that wasn't the best plan. The British had intercepted the Zimmerman telegram, but they waited a little while before leaking it to the Wilson administration, mostly because they didn't want the Germans to know that they were tapping in on their line. So at the appropriate moment, in March of 17, they did this. And really, Wilson's hands were tied at this point. And he had little, choice but to say, okay, we are going to enter this war. He gave this brilliant speech on the 2nd, and he was very troubled by the whole idea of going to war. And one observer says that when he left the Capitol and drove back to the White House, he sat in a room with his family and his aides, and they said the people that were cheering for this were actually cheering for the death of will ultimately be thousands of American lives, and that impacted him greatly, and of course he was correct on that.
And this is a version he has to war. That comes from his life growing up in the Reconstruction South, right? He had seen what war does to people's lives and to a country.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he himself was not someone who was a combatant. He wasn't really interested in the military. And yes, he recognized, Virginia really suffered greatly, especially in the Shenandoah Valley area where he was brought up during the Civil War. And it wasn't that long ago. But once, Wilson committed the U.S. to war, he really left the military aspects up to his Secretary of War, Newton D. Baker, who also really wasn't much of a war strategist. One of a biographer says that even as a child, Baker didn't even play with tin soldiers. The smartest thing that they did is they appointed General John J. Pershing to lead the American military contingent. And basically, Pershing was given really full latitude and said, you will go over to Europe, you'll cooperate with our allied partners, but you will fight independently. And that caused a lot of rancor among the main allied partners, the British and the French, who were desperate for young American men. And throughout the war, Wilson stayed out of the military aspect and really left it in the hands of Baker, who I think did a phenomenal job.
So why don't we talk about that for a minute, about Pershing when the U.S. entered the war, how Pershing interacted with the leaders of the British military and the French military. That's a really interesting aspect. And you wrote a book kind of specifically about this, your book, 47 Days.
I did, and even a previous book, which was my PhD dissertation, was called Borrowed Soldiers, and it deals with the whole aspect of the American-British relationship. We didn't have a whole lot of experience dealing with allies. The only time was during the Boxer Rebellion, or the Chinese Relief Expedition, as it was also known in the early 1900s, when a whole coalition of allies ganged up against the Chinese who were revolting in China. But going back to the point of, Pershing was told by Wilson directly that, you will fight independently. And again, it wasn't though that Wilson was thinking, strategically, militarily, that's the best option. He was thinking ahead of the game. In other words, when the war was going to come to an end, which eventually it would, he wanted the United States to have a full say at the peace table. The only way to do that is to have an independent American military. Also, he recognized that American families were not going to be very happy with their young sons serving under foreign command. Ultimately, though, Pershing had to do that to a relatively small degree, primarily because we didn't have any shipping. We had no ocean liner-sized boats to take American troops over. So we relied primarily on the British to do so. And in order to get American troops over there, the British said, well, you have to place them with our men, at least temporarily for training, and then in an emergency in line, which Pershing ultimately did, and ended up leaving 2 American divisions with the British. By the way, an American division at that time was a little under 28,000 men, which was humongous compared to about half that size for the other allies and the Germans. And the French also wanted Americans. Well, Pershing ended up shifting some of his troops with the French for training, but he ultimately gave them full use of African American troops. America was segregated at the time, certainly our military, and the idea of having commingled African American troops serving along with white troops just wasn't in the cards. And the French were okay with African American troops. They had their own great experiences with the colonial troops. So there were 4 regiments of African Americans who ended up serving entirely with the French, and then one other division, full division, served part-time with the French. But Pershing would literally battle against the Allied commanders, mainly Ferdinand Foch, the field marshal who was in charge of the Allies, and also the British commander, Sir Douglas Haig, and in regards to, when are the Americans going to go in line? You should brigade them with us. And it was a constant battle that really didn't end until the autumn of 1918, when Pershing was allowed to form his own tactical First Army, and then they went into battle at St. Mihiel, did extremely well, but then had to go fight the Meuse-Argonne front, which is the main focus of my 47 Days book. That was a struggle.
Didn't Pershing wish to execute the war in a more aggressive manner than the Allies?
Pershing was a strong believer in what was known as open warfare. In other words, sending his troops over the top, almost Civil War style. When you go back to that conflict, if you think about the attack at Pickett's Charge, or in 1863 or a year before at Marye's Heights and Fredericksburg, these full frontal assaults, Pershing felt that the Allies, by remaining behind the trenches and fighting these little set-piece battles, the war was going to go on forever, and the only way to break through the lines is to send his troops forward. He insisted that American soldiers become excellent marksmen using the rifle, and some of them did get that training while in the U.S., but a number of them didn't, primarily because we didn't have enough rifles. Some of these guys were training with broomsticks and wooden guns and actually didn't fire their rifle for the first time until they got overseas.
And this gets back into the issue that I think a lot of Americans don't understand about the history of our military. We didn't have a standing army. A lot of people think that, they take today's army like we have, and they figure that's the way it's always been. But we had to basically build an army to fight this war. Uncle Sam comes in, as a part of this propaganda effort to get people out. Could you talk a little bit about the problems of building this army?
Well, when President Wilson committed us to the war, there were something like 110,000 regular troops to professional troops that were spread around the U.S. Some of them had served with Pershing the previous year during the punitive expedition in Mexico, but most of them were in garrisons throughout the West or in forts along the East Coast. So 110,000 is nothing, just a drop in the bucket of what the Americans needed. And when the U.S. again got into the war, there really wasn't much of a organizational plan of how many troops were going to be needed, and even the size of the military. But it quickly became apparent that the U.S. was going to need to field a large fighting force. So in addition to those 110,000, Wilson also called up and federalized the National Guard. Some of them were along the Mexican border in support of the punitive expedition. Others were in their state capacity around the country. And still, that was only about an equal amount, another 110,000. So what the bulk of the troops were going to be is enlisted, but also a draft. So conscription was introduced for the first time since the Civil War. Some of that, caused some animosity, as it's done in even more recent years of, is this a rich man's war that poor men are going to end up fighting by being drafted? But there wasn't too much of any kind of repercussion against the draft. But what did cause problems is the fact that there weren't enough training camps. So the U.S. War Department had to hastily assemble these things. They put together what they called cantonments, these temporary wooden structures. And so these things were assembled, but most of them weren't ready until the autumn of 1917. So there was this whole lag period from when the U.S. got in the war in April, and not until the autumn of 1917 did we really start getting troops under proper training.
And shortly after this is the Americans get a shock because they come in April, we declare war, and we're sending troops preparing to battle, and then something crazy happens in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution. And by March of 1918, Russia, which was holding down the entire Eastern Front, bails out of the war. And now the United States has just showed up. How does that change the dynamic on the battlefield?
Well, it means that German troops who were fighting on the Eastern Front could be free to come over to the Western Front. So they were eventually shuffled over there, not right away, sent over in sort of piecemeal. A lot of them were there just to kind of oversee the occupation of the area. But as the large offensive took place in the autumn of 1918, more and more German troops were coming over. And the fighting took place all along the so-called Western Front. It wasn't just the Meuse-Argonne area. The American troops that I mentioned earlier that were with the British, there were two divisions. They fought north of Paris. There was fighting also north of there in Belgium. So it was a major offensive. But the Germans were able to bring those troops from Russia. So it changed the dynamic in the sense of the Germans had more troops, but they also recognized that the Americans had much more than anybody else. By the time that the Meuse-Argonne battle ended with the armistice of November 11th, there were about 1.2 million troops in the American army fighting on that front, and another 800,000 elsewhere. So there were 2 million American soldiers on the Western Front, just in that area alone, by the time of the armistice. And had the war continued into 1919, there would have been an additional 2 million coming over, and the Germans would have been completely overwhelmed.
I mean, that's staggering to me. That's staggering how many Americans were over there.
Well, we think about World War II and how quickly we mobilized and built our wartime economy, which is absolutely correct, but World War I was a precedent. I mean, it took a while to get the Americans over, and it goes back to one of your earlier questions about complaints from the Allies who were saying, well, when are you going to bring your troops over, General Pershing, and when are they going to go into line? He felt that he didn't want to put those troops in harm's way until they were well-trained and understood how to fight in that environment. And so it took a while. But once the Americans got going and the British gave them more shipping, more and more American troops were coming over. And the American troops turned out to be darn good. They learned the battle tactics, which are extremely difficult. Yes, casualties were high. Just in the Meuse-Argonne battle alone, 47 days long, there were over 26,000 Americans killed. About 4 times that many were wounded. All total battle casualties for the United States, known as the American Expeditionary Forces, was over 53,000 just for that year and a half of fighting. And then another 50-some thousand died of influenza and other diseases, accident, and so forth.
What was the German objective with the war? I mean, because I'm going to confess my ignorance. This is a war that I have not studied as much as I've studied other parts of history. I think our listeners, there's probably several out there who also aren't familiar with what were the factors that caused the war. And as I listen to you speak and about the battle in the Argonne Forest, I'm thinking, what were the Germans' objective at that point in the war? So can you give us maybe an overview of what started the war and what was Germany's objective?
Well, it's an excellent question, and you're going to get many different answers because the truth be told, no one really knows exactly why that war started. We know that it kicked off because of the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand and Sophie in June of 1914. But that was just sort of the tinder that exploded Europe. Europe economically at that time was doing extremely well. But there were all these sort of different factions, many of them related to the same family under Queen Victoria. And it was really about alliances that had formed well before the First World War, and these sort of jealousies and thoughts of territorial gain. Some of this was a result of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, where Germany had soundly defeated the French. The French had lost Alsace or Lorraine. So deep in the back of their minds, they were always looking for a reason to get that territory back from Germany. Germany saw the opportunity to expand its colonialism in not only in Western Europe but also Eastern Europe, and had been building up its military forces for a long time, and really just kind of looking for, I think, just an excuse to go to war. That's my sort of simplified answer. It gets a little bit more complicated than that, but the more I read about how the war started and what happened in the early part, the more I get confused. So you're not alone on this.
Well, my take on it as a historian has always been, and this is puts me in one of the particular camps on this, but tell me what you think about this. Beginning in 1492, Europeans had begun taking over the world. And by the end of the 19th century, they had taken most of the world from the indigenous peoples. And so if you're an empire and you have to continue expanding, and you have taken most of the land from the people who live there, the next step in the logic is to take it from each other.
Yeah, no, I don't think anyone would argue with that. And I think in the case of the Germans that there was somewhat of a paranoia that if they didn't strike first at some point, that the other European nations, primarily the French, were going to start expanding, and they needed to be ready for that, for the war. But once it started, there was really no looking back. I mean, no one, of course, when a war starts, thinks it's going to last as long as it does. But the Germans had their battle plan to break through and to take Paris. Well, that didn't happen, and next thing you know, it's bogged down into a defensive war with 1,000-mile trench system. From there, it becomes a war of attrition. And I don't think no one expected anything along those lines of just the mass slaughter that occurred.
One of the most remarkable things that happens in this war, from my perspective, is the Christmas truce. This moment where these troops who have been fighting each other come together and celebrate a holiday. Could you talk about that?
Well, it's an interesting thing because it's Christmas of 1914, so of course it's the first year of the war, and again, nobody knows that it's the first year of the war. I mean, it's assumed by that point where there's no fighting, because most of the fighting doesn't take place in the wintertime. It's too cold to move troops and supplies and so forth. And here's this moment where British troops and German troops had been battling each other, months and weeks and months before. And then all of a sudden, they both recognize that they're human beings, they're around the same age range, and they have similar backgrounds and similar interests. Sort of a unifying, interest between them is playing football or soccer, and the idea that for a brief moment they're going to stop shooting each other. They're going to stop trying to kill each other through trench raids, artillery blasts, airplanes, and other elements of war. Gas hadn't been introduced at this point, but that they're going to take this break and almost be friends. Of course, the officers were appalled at this because this isn't something you do in warfare. You don't all of a sudden become friends with your belligerent. Maybe you have a truce for burial or some sort of negotiation, but you don't stop fighting, and you certainly don't play a sports activity with each other. So the officers only allowed this to go on for a short amount of time. And there were other sort of truces throughout the war, but there was none as more celebrated than the 1914 Christmas truce.
And it's remarkable because, as I've heard the story, there are different accounts, but, the British troops heard the German troops singing Christmas carols. And you know how, you'll sing, "Oh Christmas Tree," but in German it's "O Tannenbaum, O Tannenbaum." It was the same tune, though, and they felt they had that in common. And it's amazing to me that in the middle of the war it happens there, and then also in Turkey, in Gallipoli. The stories of soldiers, the Anzacs flipping cigarettes over the trenches to their Turkish counterparts who needed cigarettes, in between trying to kill each other. It's just amazing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, similar stories came out of the American Civil War, where Confederate and Union troops one moment are blasting Napoleon cannons at each other, and the next moment they're exchanging coffee for tobacco or newspapers. And there was that moment of, that sort of camaraderie. Of course, they're both Americans, so it's a little different in that sense to have Germans and British do that sort of thing. But I think, both sides recognize that this was a war that was going to go on for a long time, and they needed some sort of break, something to relieve the stress, I guess.
Earlier, you mentioned the African American soldiers who were, who they were sent over to dig ditches and to do grunt work, and the French said, we'll take them and we'll make them fighting men. I was speaking with David Childers, my friend and great singer-songwriter David Childers, this morning about that very aspect of the war, and he was talking about what happened to those African American soldiers when they returned home after fighting the war, taking part, having an active role. They came back home to the United States, and how were they treated?
Well, David is absolutely right. I mean, there were 200,000 African American troops in France during World War One, most of which, as you mentioned, did stevedore work on the docks, unloading supplies from the ships. They also did labor battalion work, which meant, as you say, digging trenches and digging roads and basically the grunt work. Some of them were also in pioneer infantry units, which were kind of combinations of engineers, infantry, but they would go out in front and kind of clear a path, dangerous work. But they didn't get to fight in the sense of under General Pershing's command. And that's something that African Americans desperately wanted. And of course, it's shown in previous wars that they were fully capable of doing so. But while they were on leave or away from the front, and they were in cafes in Paris and Bordeaux and other French cities, they could fraternize with French citizens. They could fraternize with French women. They could drink wine. They could smoke, hang out at the cafes without having, this being chased away. There wasn't any segregation issues. But then they come back to the United States, and it's a whole different story again. It goes back to, okay, well, you contributed to the war effort, but now, because you're black, you're going to be treated as segregated kids. So many of the African Americans came back to France after the war because they had such a great experience, and as I'm sure you know, and it helped really develop the evolution of jazz in France.
That's right.
The 369th, either Harlem Hellfighters or Rattlers. They had a couple of different nicknames. Their band was second to none, led by James Reese Europe, and they played in France in the rear areas, and it really helped to kickstart jazz in that country. I just finished reading a biography of Django Reinhardt, and it talks a lot about that.
Oh, wow. That would be great to read. And even going into the 40s and 50s, a lot of African-American jazz artists would go to France, and they were treated like the celebrities and like the great artists, as great artists should be treated. They were treated well. They were treated with dignity and respect like human beings. I don't understand how we in this country have had a compulsion since our founding to elevate one human being over another. It's just a vicious human cycle that seems to keep going on, and it's really awful.
Yeah, well, as far as the military is concerned, of course, it stayed that way until President Truman desegregated the military in, I think it was 1947 after World War II. But it was still a segregated army through World War II, and it is amazing.
So how did World War I set up World War II?
Well, you can look at it from the aspect of the German stab in the back theory, that it was the German government that had surrendered and not the troops out in the field. And I think there's a lot of validity to that. The fact of the matter is that the Germans agreed to an armistice that was to take place on November 11th at 11 a.m., and they stuck with it. There was some fear that the Germans were going to renege on that promise. In fact, the fighting took place right up until 11 a.m. There were casualties even a few minutes after. And the Germans complained that the Allies, especially the Americans, were continuing to attack. The American tactical commander at the time, Lieutenant General Hunter Liggett, was called before Congress after the war and had to explain why the Americans were continuing. He said, well, the Field Marshal Foch, who's head of the Allies, said, look, you need to continue fighting because an armistice is not a surrender. And the Germans kind of remembered that. You know, the Versailles Treaty had beat up Germany pretty bad and placed the entire blame of the war on them. The Germans, were very, very, unhappy about that. Needless to say, I mean, certainly Germany did kickstart the war, but you can also say, as we talked about earlier, that even the French were looking for, I think, a reason to go to war. And I don't know if all of the blame should have been placed on Germany. But coupled with that and the fact that during the so-called interwar period, the German military was not kept in check. They were supposed to have reduced their armaments and held back from, reinforcing them. Well, that didn't happen. And then with worldwide depression, really caused the rise of Nazism. And it allowed somebody like Adolf Hitler to come to power. And it was just more of a matter of time. What's interesting is that General Pershing was not in total agreement of the armistice. He felt like Germany needed to be soundly defeated, even more than they were, and he wanted his American troops to go into Germany, occupy German cities while the war was still going on. The occupation didn't take place until later on, but the other belligerents, primarily the British and the French, they were tired. They had been beaten up pretty bad, and they were ready for the war to come to an end. I think people like Pershing and other commanders recognize that really it was only the beginning, that another world war was eventually going to break out, and they were correct.
And Hitler fought in World War I.
He did. He fought in the Australian army. He was wounded near the Somme, and I believe he was decorated. So he understood what warfare was, but we could have a whole discussion about Hitler as a military commander and what could have happened.
All right, so I've got my own answer to this question, but I want to know what yours is. Who won World War I?
Well, in my opinion, the Americans did. We were the reason that the war turned completely in favor of the Allies. Had the U.S. not joined the war, and this question comes up all the time, and I've been asked it numerous times, and as a historian, it's kind of fun to play with. My opinion is there would have been some sort of armistice before 1918. The Germans were running out of troops, the French were running out of troops, the British were running out of troops. And it was a matter of time before somebody had to collapse. And I think there would have been an armistice, and I think it would have been more in favor of the Germans. And maybe that would have caused World War II to start earlier. But there's no doubt about it that the American troops coming over, those 1.2 million that fought in the Meuse-Argonne and the other 800,000 that fought elsewhere on the Western Front, plus we had troops in Italy, also in North Russia and Siberia. The American troops turned the tide and brought the war to a close in the favor of the Allies. What do you think?
I think the Bolsheviks won World War I, honestly. There's no way they would have come to power if it were for World War I.
I got to say, Ben, just to interrupt you for a minute, if you're a surgeon and there's a problem, it needs a scalpel. If you're a psychiatrist and there's a problem, you need some talk therapy. Well, Ben is a Russian historian, so if there's a problem, it's Russia. Russia is the answer. Russia.
I commend that because a lot of people don't recognize Russia took really the brunt of the war. They had more casualties, had more troops than anyone, and took more casualties. The same thing happened to them. It's amazing that they had enough troops to field during World War II with the number that were killed, and I don't have the figure in front of me, but it was absolutely astronomical. And so I don't disagree with you too much.
Yeah, and I don't mean it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek answer always, because it's just a matter of the Bolsheviks just had no business running a country, and they were not the top choice. And if it weren't for the chaos created by World War I, there's no way anybody would have listened to them.
True. Absolutely.
So, Mitch, where is the World War I memorial?
The World War I memorial is an important phase this week, actually. On Thursday, the Fine Arts Commission in Washington will meet to either say yay or nay about the design. If they say nay, then the project, unfortunately, is dead in the water. If they say yay, that's excellent news, but there's still a lot of money that needs to be raised. So far, the federal budget hasn't come forward to bring any money to the commission. It's all relying on private donations through corporations. The Pritzker Library in Chicago continues to be generous in its matching grants, but there's still a long way to go, even pending approval this week, before the memorial will be built and hopefully dedicated on November 11th of 2018. So keep your fingers crossed.
So I did a terrible job at setting that question up. Basically, there isn't a World War I memorial on the mall, in the National Mall in Washington, D.C., correct?
It's tragic.
There isn't. The closest we have, there's the District of Columbia has a beautiful monument on the mall, or the area, not far from there, I should say. But that's dedicated to the residents of D.C. The closest is the Pershing monument, which is where the new memorial will go, and that's across from the Willard Hotel off of Pennsylvania Avenue, but it's in complete disarray. It needs a total renovation, which is what the memorial will do, and it'll make it more of a kind of a living memorial where people can take pride. There's also the possibility of changing the plan and maybe putting a smaller memorial over where the World War II one is, which in a sense, based on your questions, it kind of makes perfect sense in that regard, because of the fact that World War I obviously led into World War II, or there wouldn't be a second World War. So we'll see what happens, and it's important to have a memorial in Washington, the nation's capital, and to recognize what those 2 million troops overseas, the other 2 million. And when I say troops, I also should point out that there were a significant number of women who also participated as either nurses and role as telephone operators, the Hello Girls, which both were extremely important, and the Army couldn't have functioned without either one.
Can you tell our listeners how they can donate or be involved in the memorial project?
Sure. They can certainly go online, which is the best place, and look up the it's called the United States World War I ONE Centennial Commission. And they'll go on there, and it's a beautiful website in the sense of it's just not, begging for money, but there's lots of information on there about America in the First World War, lots of facts. There's films, there's documentary clips, interesting little tidbits. And there's a link on there, of course, to send money. The other thing that they can do is to write to their congressperson or U.S. senators and say, hey, we need to get more involved in this before it's too late, before the World War I Centennial comes to an end.
Well, Mitch, we've really enjoyed speaking with you today.
Yeah, it was fun, and best of luck with the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Thank you for joining us today on The Road to Now. Our program is produced by Bob Crawford, Ben Sawyer, and Ian Scotta, edited by Bob Crawford and Ian Scotta. Paul DeFiglia provides our music. Please be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and rate us on iTunes. For more information about this or any other episode, please visit theroadtonow.com. For Dr. Ben Sawyer, this is Bob Crawford. Take care.